If you have been someone who has been watching anime or reading manga for quite some time, you're probably familiar with a handful of memes and lists of things like anime's worst parents, that type of stuff. And most of the time, Hohenheim, Ed and Al's father from Fullmetal Alchemist, would often pop up. And for some clarification, I will be discussing the Brotherhood and manga version of this character and not his '03 version, mostly because you might actually make a case against Hohenheim in that version of the series, where some of his actions are rather questionable in retrospect. But in regards to Brotherhood, I will sometimes see this version of Hohenheim mostly being talked about in a negative context. Granted, nowadays I rarely hear this from fans due to more people possibly watching Brotherhood more than the original, but the discussion sometimes comes up every now and again. And there is a possibility that the dislike of his character mostly comes from the '03 version, similar to the discourse regarding Colonel Mustang. So in this video, I'm going to perform a little bit of a character deep dive into Hohenheim and discuss that even though he may not have been the best father, he still might be one of the best characters in Brotherhood.
It seems as though your son enjoys being held hostage. It's either that or he's supremely stupid.
That's crossing a line, Pride. Don't ever mock my son.
Now, being someone who has read and watched Brotherhood several times, it is quite clear that Brotherhood is Hohenheim's story just as much as it is Ed and Al's, not only having a strong connection to the main villain father, but also his connection to the world. Example being the massive implication that he helped Xing find outcastry. His journey as a character is also something that, to me at least, is something that is masterfully done, showing us via flashbacks of who Hohenheim was, that he was a slave in the ancient city of Xerxes, but learned to become an alchemist by father, who at this point was the dwarf in a flask. We see a bit of a bond and a connection form between the two, up till father manipulates the king into turning the entire city into a philosopher's stone, one that is split between the two. Since father was formed from Hohenheim's blood, we see that once he obtained a massive amount of power, he gained his appearance, explaining why the two resemble each other. And seeing that, despite the souls being turned into a philosopher's stone, we see that they're very much alive and that their screams and anguish can actually still be heard by both Hohenheim and father, this being something that Hohenheim took centuries to live with, him trying to coordinate and talk to each and every single soul within him to gain some level of understanding. As the years go by, Hohenheim befriends Panako, Winry's grandmother, and many years after that befriends and marries Tricia Elric, which leads to the birth of Edward and Alphonse Elric. Now, the few years Hohenheim was a father were not bad by any means. In fact, if you read the manga, there is a short chapter where Edward misbehaves against Alphonse and Hohenheim disciplines him by teaching him a lesson, not by smacking him round, spanking him, laying hands on him in any nature, but by simply making him hold a bucket of water. After a while, Edward gives up holding it because of how heavy it was. Hohenheim notices this and asks Ed why he stopped holding it. Ed says it's because of how heavy it was, and Hohenheim responded by saying the bucket of water was the same weight as Alphonse was when Tricia was pregnant with him, and tells Ed that if Tricia did not give up on Alphonse in the 9 months she had him, Edward should not have eaten her, especially since they are family. This chapter pretty much demonstrates the strong bond between Ed and Al and where it originated, and despite Edward's, albeit justified, hatred of his father, he does owe a strong bond to Alphonse, to that lesson he taught him when he was a young age, pretty much showing that despite not really being there most of their lives, Hohenheim still played a crucial role in Alpha and Edward's development. And this takes us to pretty much the main contention for Hohenheim's character. The reason why not only Ed, but most of the fans kinda hate him for a while and regard him as a bad father, him leaving Tricia, Edward, and Alphonse behind for a massive portion of their lives, not even coming to Tricia's funeral, this being a massive part in Edward's hatred for his father. Now, we are shown in the final battle that not only was father planned to turn Amestris into a giant philosopher's stone to gain the power of God, but also that Hohenheim discovered this plot many years ago and sought to undo this plan before it even happens, meaning that Hohenheim had to leave his family and travel the country and plant pieces of his own Philosopher's Stone at the very points he needed to in order to create an anti-transmutation circle that allowed him to undo Father's plan. And despite leaving for seemingly the greater good, it is very apparent that Hohenheim hated this action he took, evident by his reaction to Tricia's final message to him that she couldn't keep her promise.
Sorry I couldn't keep my promise. But I'm dying first. So there, I told you!
Hohenheim loved Tricia, and the man knew he was going to sacrifice his happiness to save the world. Von Hohenheim may not have been a great father. In a way, you can make the argument he is to blame for Edward and Alphonse Day at the beginning of the series, that them losing both their parents in a way drove them to committing the ultimate taboo in alchemy, human transmutation. If their father had been there when their mother passed, they would have had someone to help them mourn for their loss. But despite that, Hohenheim to me is one of the best characters in the series, simply for him knowing the sacrifice he had to commit, just to ensure that the people of Amestris would not suffer the same fate as the people of Xerxes, of Ishval. And for that, Hohenheim may not have been a great father, but he was a good man. And despite him not being there for Al and Ed when they needed him most, he still loved them, and if the world was different, if the cars were different, he absolutely would have been there. Hohenheim may have been a flawed individual, but he had a good heart. A heart made full metal.